Hi everyone, I'm Tej Smrtipati and I'm going to be talking about the movie JSA, which stands for Joint Security Area. This movie was released on January 1st, 2000. In this presentation, I will cover information about the director, the cast, the historical backgrounds, a summary of the movie, and finally, what I learned. The director of this movie is Park Chan-wook. Park Chan-wook was born and raised in Seoul on August 23rd, 1963. He was also known for making the English language movie Stoker. Another interesting fun fact is JSA was the most watched film in South Korea, passing Shiri at one point in time. So the cast of the movie is Lee Young-ae as Major Jean, Lee Byung-hun as Sergeant Lee, Kim Tae-woo as Nam, Song Kang-ho, Shin Ha-kyun as Jung. Historical background: DMZ. So the DMZ was a strip of land that serves as a buffer zone between North and South Korea since 1953. The DMZ is 250 kilometers long and 4 kilometers wide. Inside the DMZ, 1 kilometer east of the Panmunjom village is the Joint Security Area that this movie is named after. Basically, this is an almost circular patch of land with an 800-meter diameter. It's also the only place in the DMZ where soldiers from both sides stand face to face and where negotiating takes place. Now we'll move on to the plot of the movie. Introduction. The film begins with Swiss Army Major Sophie Jean from the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission getting assigned to investigate a terrible shooting incident that occurred at the Joint Security Area between the North and the South. The North and the South are on extremely thin ice after the incident, and therefore her captain orders her to remain perfectly neutral and not provoke either side. She is also told that they already have a confession of who shot who, and she needs to just figure out the why. Investigation. The testimony. Major Jean first meets with Sergeant Lee Soo-hyuk, who is in critical condition. Sergeant Lee claims that he was kidnapped and tied up to a chair in the North Korean border house. He says that he managed to untie himself and shoot 3 of the North Korean soldiers, of which 2 are dead and 1 is alive. The one who is alive is Sergeant Oh. Sergeant Oh from North Korea, on the other hand, claims that Sergeant Soo-hyuk broke into the border house and shot everybody. Sergeant Oh, who got hit with the bullets, fired back, and that's when Sergeant Lee ran away. The conflicting responses from these two made Major Jean aware that something's very fishy. Investigation. Private Nam and the bullet. Major Jean ends up finding an extra bullet in Sergeant Lee's gun. There were 11 shots on the dead body and 5 that remained in Sergeant Lee's gun. That means there had to have been a total of 16 bullets in Sergeant Lee's gun. Major Jean saw that Sergeant Lee's gun can only hold 15 bullets unless an extra bullet is loaded at the top, which highly depends on the habit of the shooter. Major Jean demanded that Sergeant Lee shows her how he loads the gun. During this demonstration, Sergeant Lee only loaded 15 bullets. This is a crucial moment for the story because Major Jean realizes that this means that someone else was with Sergeant Lee since an extra bullet is found in the dead body. Major Jean and her team also investigated Private Nam, another soldier who works as border patrol along with Sergeant Lee. In fact, Major Jean traced the gun's serial number back to Private Nam's gun. In Private Nam's gun, it was found that there was blood on the barrel, the same blood of one of the North Korean officers who was shot. After hearing all this evidence and being threatened to a lie detector test, Private Nam couldn't take it anymore, and he ended up committing suicide by shooting himself in the mouth. This scene really indicates to the audience that Major Jean is slowly breaking down the truth behind this case. Flashbacks to truth. After Private Nam's suicides, the movie transitions into a flashback of the truth. That is, the movie details the story of what really happened. Sergeant Lee crossed the border and almost set off a mine in a field. However, luckily, Sergeant O and the other sergeant were also there. Initially, there was tension between the two sides as they are technically enemies. However, Sergeant O still undoes the mine for Sergeant Lee. Shortly after returning to their respective bases, Sergeant Lee throws a heartfelt thank you note over to the North Korean base side, where Sergeant O and Sergeant Jung reside. He calls Sergeant O brother in this note. Over the next few days, Sergeant Lee and the North Korean base exchange notes with one another. One day, when Private Nam is asleep, Sergeant Lee slips out the South Korean base door and goes over to the North Korean base. At first, the Sergeant O is shocked, but over time, they develop a friendship that brings happiness to the audience's emotions. The movie portrays the two sides bonding together over games, drinks, and stories. Eventually, Sergeant Lee convinces Private Nam to come over to the other side as well, and the four soldiers start visiting each other every night. The incident. One day, a North Korean commander did a checkup on the North Korean officers. Unfortunately, he came at a time when all four of the soldiers were bonding. This led to an intense face-off between all 5 people in the room, including the friends. Everyone is pointing guns at each other, and there's a lot of tension in the room. Eventually, in a haste, Private Nam can't control his anxiety and ends up shooting the North Korean commander. He also rapid-fires several bullets into Jung while panicking. Sergeant O then unloads another bullet into the commanding officer to kill him and orders Lee and Nam to escape immediately. O tells them to escape and claim that Sergeant Lee was kidnapped. Tragic ending. The movie exits the flashback and re-enters into the present. Major Jean is kicked off the case because it was found that her father had North Korean ties and therefore it wouldn't be considered a neutral investigation. Major Jean, out of her own curiosity, continues to investigate the true incident and learns of what really happened. Sergeant Lee shortly after steals a gun from an office and kills himself. Sergeant Lee clearly wasn't able to cope with the pain of Jung and Private Nam's deaths. What I learned. I found this movie did a great job of touching the emotions of the audience. I learned that the North and South Koreans only have this rivalry because of politics. Aside from the politics, the North and South Koreans are very similar culturally as they share language, food, and music as seen throughout the movie. It was clear from the start, especially the landmine scene where Sergeant O saved Sergeant Lee, that these soldiers don't really want to fight one another deep inside. Instead, what they want is for the North and South to set aside the politics and come to peace with one another. Unfortunately, despite all the bonding shown throughout the movie, both sides end up shooting at one another. This made me realize the overwhelming power the governments have over the army. Despite calling one another brothers, fear of betraying their respective governments was too strong, especially with Private Nam.